now it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Jason Beggar. Jason is now the Executive Director of the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority. In a previous life, he was also an active member of the whole federal effort on 45Q, and his new role remained engaged. So we invited Jason because we thought we're all here in Wyoming. You've heard over the course of the day so far, many of you came here already knowing this, that Wyoming stands out for its leadership on these issues, but also for the diversity of things that are happening around carbon capture, around carbon management, the new carbon economy, and in the process of that, and there's a lot of folks that I could recognize, and Jason will talk about this, that deserve recognition, but we're now, a new way of thinking about this and a new politics, if you will, is emerging in that. I heard saw a TED Talk that Jason gave that I thought was just a perfect fit for this event. So Jason, I want to thank you for being here, and he's going to share some of the things that are going on right here in Wyoming.
All right. Thanks, Brad. I'm going to give a little bit different talk than I'm used to. Most of the people, or most of the talks I give nowadays are with regards to the Integrated Test Center. A lot of you who I know in this room is kind of in that capacity, but I'm going to talk a little bit more today about sort of the Wyoming approach with the, sort of the networking and the strategy and the philosophy, and actually why, a state like Wyoming, which is considered to be, very conservative, very Republican, some people say have their heads stuck in the mud, are actually pretty progressive on carbon management. And so that ITC speech I could give in my sleep, but this one's going to be a little bit different, more towards that TED Talk I gave. So I do have my security blanket here, so I may need to look at that a little bit, because I think it was like 2 days ago when we finally decided what I was going to talk about. But so kind of first things first, to set the stage is, are there any history majors in this room? Oh wow, that's way better. Usually I'm the only one, incredibly useful degree. But I think in this context, it does a really good job of setting the stage. So in 1893, Wyoming adopted the state seal. You look up there, you see a shovel and a pickaxe. And actually, if you look at a lot of the states in the West, this is a very common theme. A nod to the sort of the history and the heritage of mining in settling the state. If you flash forward 125 years, mining is still a very important part of the culture and the society and everything that's going on in Wyoming. The state is the largest producer of coal and bentonite, trona, uranium, top 10 in crude oil, natural gas. We have some of the best wind resources in the country. I know our last speaker is from Rock Springs. I live in Cheyenne. Those are pretty windy places. But the fact of the matter is Wyoming is a resource state. The extractive industries provide billions of tax dollars to the state every year. Those things fund many of our essential services. And even during the last few years of low commodity prices and economic downturn, the extractive industries, specifically the fossil energy industry, has provided about 2/3 of the state's tax revenue. This means funding for things like schools, roads, first responders, hospitals, prisons, social programs, countless other government services. And as citizens of the state, we all benefit because we don't pay any income tax. We have no sales tax on food. And if you are lucky enough, you can actually go to college for free due to something called the Hathaway Scholarship. And also the way that the state structured coal leases is they've paid for basically every new school in the state over the last 20 years. I think new school construction is like $2.2 billion in the last 20 years, and it's all coal lease bonuses. So, it's a massive part of what the state is and why it's so important to see this industry be successful. So, when you talk about terms like climate change, global warming, ozone depletion, those are very strong words that elicit strong feelings among citizens and political activists and NGOs and business leaders and pretty much anybody else with a pulse. But the fact of the matter, those are political buzzwords that tend to often make people's blood pressure rise and retreat to your preferred political corner. They don't actually necessarily get us to where we need to be. You know, you're not going to tend to want to work with somebody who continues to poke you in the eye. So, you know, for decades, this us versus them mentality has dominated the discussion concerning climate change and carbon management. You know, Democrats versus Republicans, environmentalists versus miners, renewable energy versus fossil fuels, you know, and unfortunately, neither side has ceded much ground. But what has all this heated debate gotten us? I think we know what the answer is. It's anger, resentment, bitterness, but certainly not solutions. Governor Meade recognized this a couple years ago and basically came out and said, you know what, the time for debate over climate change is over. Doesn't matter, because you know, a state that's lifeblood is natural resources. This was a pretty strong statement and a pretty big leap. But he recognized that the world is calling for reduced carbon emissions, and it's a social, political, and economic reality. So if the time for debate was over, and what comes next? For Wyoming, it came, or it really was, focusing on these solutions and finding a win-win. You know, how do we keep coal as an important economic engine within the state, but yet address these societal concerns over climate change? Change from thinking of CO2 as a liability or a waste product and looking at it as an asset. You know, there's value from not only developing the technologies, you know, and selling the CO2 for EOR and some of the conversion things that folks have been talking about, but also the industries with developing the technology. So think back to 30 years ago, you know, there was a lot of discussion about acid rain, and I was born in the 70s, but I remember in the 80s there were a lot of things like 60 Minutes, you know, acid rain is going to disintegrate the Washington Monument or buildings in DC or whatever. Well, clearly that didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen was sulfur dioxide scrubbers were invented. If you think about generation before that, smog and soot was the big issue. Well, first electrostatic precipitators were invented, and then the next generation was bag houses. But the important takeaway is with a proven track record, technology is the best way to combat environmental challenges. So that's the easy part. The really hard part is how do you develop these technologies without the cloud of politics and rhetoric. Technology is an engineering challenge. Climate change, global warming, it's a political football. And only by separating the two will we find that solution. So Wyoming embraced technology advancement through the creation of things such as the Wyoming School of Energy Resources, Enhanced Soil Recovery Institute, Steve is here, Carbon Management Institute at the university, the Wyoming Integrated Test Center, which we're a part of, you know, the Pipeline Corridor Initiative, you know, Matt Fry with the governor's office here, he's been a big part of that. And these entities weren't created overnight, but it took that common vision over a number of years to understand that developing these fundamental pieces were important, not only to the extractive industry or the tax base, but for the new possibilities. So multiple governors and different generations of legislators kind of recognize the collective importance of these public-private partnerships. You know, the public-private nexus can be a huge obstacle, but it cannot be understated how important it is. Technology that is developed that is of no interest to industry is nothing more than a cool science project. And cool science is really cool science, but if it's not commercialized, we're not moving the needle forward. So, you know, we have to have those eventual technology adopters at the table. So over the past 15 years, the state has developed these individual pieces, but now it's time to link them together into a major project. And major projects take champions, not cheerleaders. It's easy to say something needs to be done, but it's much harder to roll up your sleeves and actually drive a project. So let's think about that. Any project needs three things. First of all, it needs to be economical. If it's not profitable or it doesn't show a pathway to profitability, there's not really going to be much interest in doing it. You know, things like 45Q go a long way towards improving that economic viability. Secondly, it needs to be feasible. Feasible in a couple ways. One is the technology needs to work, or as many of you in the room are working on, finding that glide path to making the technology work. But another thing is it needs to be feasible from a permitting and regulatory standpoint. You know, I'm guessing you can get certain permits in Wyoming that you can't in California. But that's also a mind shift, or a state of mind in Wyoming. Our DEQ director, Parfit, is here. And a couple weeks ago when we had the X-Prize folks talking, the common theme was we've never done this before, but let's think about how we get to yes. Understanding the parameters that we have to live with, but the Wyoming is way at how do we get to yes, not 20 reasons why this can't happen. So that's really important. And lastly, you know, I think this one probably gets it more than most, but it needs to have political support. You know, nothing can derail a great idea like egos and grandstanding and rhetoric. If you look at some of the big projects like Keystone, Dakota Access, those were derailed because they didn't have the political support in certain ways to make those projects a reality. So, you know, there's a saying that politics is the art of the possible, the attainable. So in a society where litigation and regulations often dictate what gets done, not everybody will support a major CCUS project. So you also need to know what's important to others. Wyoming's a coal state. So saying we need to get rid of coal won't get you very far here. But focusing on the collective vision of managing carbon emissions will open a lot of doors. So, but you also need to understand where the utilities are coming from. You know, understand the difference between are they regulated or are they not regulated? You know, what resources do they have? What's their generation mix look like? You know, what's their future long-term plans? You know, these are businesses with service obligations, and they have this mentality where they need to plan for the worst case scenario, where oftentimes public policy and elected officials are pushing them towards the best case scenario. So Wyoming concentrates on the shared goals and ignores unimportant distractions such as political definitions. Regulations are expected, but we also need to look at whether or not they impede what we need to do. Simple changes to things like new source review and permitting for CO2 pipelines could move the needle in meaningful ways, in ways that don't cost a lot of money. So I would task NGOs and different environmental groups is look at the bigger picture. You know, can we move the needle a little bit on some of these regulatory reforms to get where we need to go? So all of these things add up. But you know, every day Wyoming demonstrates that energy production and maintaining a clean and healthy environment are not mutually exclusive. You guys are in Jackson Hole. I mean, Wyoming's home to the nation's first national park, the first national forest, the first national monument. We have some of the cleanest air in the nation. And we've long been at the forefront of progressive environmental laws. We passed some of the first laws regarding carbon capture and sequestration. We are one of the first states to consider and enact severance taxes to ensure our citizens received a share of the mineral wealth. We passed state mining reclamation laws before the federal government. You know, the state has a long and storied history of responsible stewardship of land management. But of course, debate is important in democratic society. It's what helps spur change and bring about new ideas. You know, but I think we can also agree that far too often political debate triggers all sorts of rivalries and creates gridlock. You know, imagine what we can get accomplished if we check those political labels at the door, talk about what's important and shared, and move towards just finding those solutions. So that's the way Wyoming is moving forward on things. It's so great that everybody has agreed to come out and spend a couple days here. It's a little rainy, a little wet, but you know what? Jackson any time of year is pretty awesome. So thanks a lot.